is coming under increasing strain. Moscow notes that Damascus is still the only party actually observing the agreement, while so-called moderate rebels, backed by the US, continue to shell residential areas. RT has received footage showing the latest developments on the ground in Aleppo, which has seen some of the fiercest fighting to date.
The situation in the city is still tense. Residential areas and Syrian army positions have been shelled 15 times in the last 24 hours.
Well, to make the ceasefire easier to monitor, the Russian Defense Ministry is currently streaming live pictures of the fragile ceasefire in Aleppo. Now we're linking through to an airborne drone for this live stream, while cameras are showing footage on the ground as well. Well, we asked former Pentagon official Michael Maloof which sides could be interested in derailing the truce.
I think what's happening on the ground is that the so-called moderates that the U.S. supports is actually vying for more positions of strength. They're using the lull in the ceasefire to regain battlefield positioning. They really want to take Aleppo, and I think that this is going to continue on. They don't want to have a settlement with President Assad of Syria. They want him out, and we're all working against cross purposes. And the United States is so confused because it backs the Saudis on the one hand, but they want to have a ceasefire on the other, and yet we can't. They're not sharing intelligence on who the so-called moderates really are, and it's just one kabuki. Right now, that's what the Russians are asking for, is tell us who these groups are. Let's have full accountability. Let's declassify the agreement. I don't know why it's classified in the first place.
Well, Washington views the so-called moderate opposition as the main force, both to tackle Assad politically and to fight Islamic State on the ground.
In the fight against ISIL, we cannot rely on an Assad regime that terrorizes its own people. Instead, we must strengthen the opposition as the best counterweight to extremists like ISIL.
Can you tell us what the total number of trained fighters remains?
It's a small number, and the ones that are in the fight is we're talking four or five.
This train and equip program has not, frankly, lived up to what we initially thought.
Nobody's abandoning forever the idea of training. It's just that there's going to be a pause here while a focus is more aptly put on the equipping aspect. It does not remove from the field and from the fight Syrian fighters that are actively engaged against ISIL. You can supply them and equip them and support them.
However, Washington now seems to doubt whether those it supports can ever take control, according to the latest comments from U.S. National Security Advisor Susan Rice.
Assad will never be able to restore legitimacy throughout the country. The opposition is probably never going to be strong enough to topple Assad.
Well, a key stumbling block in the Syria talks has been the failure to split US-backed rebels and terrorists. Secretary of State John Kerry now says there are ways to divide the two, though the State Department had previously acknowledged real problems in telling the factions apart.
We recognize that, in places like Aleppo and elsewhere, that there's a mixing or commingling, whatever you want to call it, and that we need to work more closely together to disentangle, where these groups are mixing with known terrorist groups.
Based upon the public statements that were made yesterday, he seems to be suggesting that they're no longer going to support groups such as the Al-Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda, and others, and that they're going to separate what he describes as the moderate opposition to President Bashar al-Assad. They have been saying something similar to this for the last several years, but objectively on the ground, the role that the United States has been playing and its allies has clearly work to undermine peace and stability in Syria. They are perhaps trying to formulate a new strategy to carry out those same interests. If they don't come up with any viable solution in Syria, of course, the next administration will inherit this crisis.
Are rising between its brokers. The US, which backs some rebel groups in the civil war, and Russia, which supports troops loyal to President Bashar al-Assad, agreed to cool fighting starting last Monday. It was hoped their joint focus would turn to combating ISIL and other jihadist factions. However, Russian President Vladimir Putin says the US is more focused on holding on to the rebels' military capacity than abiding by the terms of the truce, casting doubt on Washington's commitment to the deal. We, Russia and the US, agreed that al-Nusra Front should be distanced from the opposition and their location should be disclosed, as well as that of the so-called healthy or moderate forces, he said. What do we see instead? We see no separation of terrorists and healthy forces, but rather attempts by terrorists to regroup and maintain their potential. One of the goals of the ceasefire was to separate moderate and militant groups. Another was to enable aid through to the worst affected areas. Both sides blame the other for delays in supplies getting through. The United Nations, meanwhile, has accused the Syrian government of blocking access to some areas.
The London-based Syrian Observatory for Human Rights says the jet came down in the Jebel Thada area, near the government's military airport. On Saturday, US-led coalition airstrikes reportedly killed dozens of Syrian soldiers in Jebel Thada. Tensions between Moscow and Washington are escalating. There are concerns the US-Russia brokered ceasefire is under threat. We consider that such an incident with a lot of victims only came about due to a lack of understanding of the context by the coalition's command and because of the refusal by the US side to coordinate its actions against terrorist groups in Syria with Russia. We're currently awaiting clarification. Coalition forces say they were targeting what was thought to be an ISIL position. The operation was brought to an end as soon as they were warned of the presence of Syrian government forces. The commander of US forces in the Middle East says the coalition would never intentionally target Syrian government forces.
Al-Rai near the Turkish border after being threatened by rebel fighters.
أمريكا يلا عملاء أمريكا كلاب عملاء أمريكا.
This is an alleged video of the incident that surfaced online. Rebels reportedly belonging to a group backed by the US are heard chanting anti-American slogans. The US forces reportedly crossed the Turkish border into Syria as part of an operation to coordinate airstrikes against ISIL. However, it seems they decided to return back to Turkey after Syrian rebels furiously protested against their presence in the area. The rebels were chanting anti-American slogans as well as threatening the troops with violence. Earlier, Washington had confirmed that it was assisting Turkey in its anti-ISIL operations in the area. The Pentagon hasn't yet commented on the latest reports. We'll be bringing you more on this story. We can now cross to our correspondent in Syria, Lizzie Phelan. Lizzie, good to see you. What more do we know about this so far?
Hi, Nikki. How are you doing? I'm actually just arrived to Beirut, just left Syria. But I have been following this story nevertheless, and the Pentagon, obviously, as you said, hasn't yet responded to these videos that have emerged. But they have, of course, confirmed that they do have special operations forces accompanying Turkish military forces and Turkish-backed rebels in northern Syria around the Al-Rai area where these videos emerged from, and further east in Jarablus. And this is likely to be very embarrassing for the United States. Free Syrian army fighters, the so-called moderate rebels that the Americans and the Turks have been insisting for years now are the acceptable opposition in Syria, openly calling for the slaughter of American forces and calling their presence in Syria an invasion of Syrian lands. As I said, very embarrassing for the Americans and really highlighting the problems of the Americans openly intervening in a country like Syria, in the Middle East rather, where their past interventions really bring up many bad memories for people in the region. And it seems like the only place that they're really kind of more openly wanted is in the Kurdish areas of Syria. Of course, the Americans now have been backing the predominantly Kurdish militia, the YPG, since 2014, when the Kurds famously defeated ISIS in the town of Ain al-Arab in Kurdish, and more famously internationally known as Kobani. And just yesterday, there were pictures and videos that emerged of American flags flying above another town controlled by the YPG near to Kobani called Tel Abyad. And today, a CNN reporter said that US officials have said that initial reports suggest that those flags were placed there by American forces as a warning to Turkey and Turkish-backed forces not to attack Americans, because of course Turkey has openly declared war on the Americans' Kurdish allies and pledged to push them back from the border that it shares with Syria. So a really worrying situation for the Americans, and the problems that they're facing growing with the growing numbers of boots on the ground backing a growing amount of groups in Syria.
Lizzie, thanks for that. RT's Lizzie Phelan there. Thanks again. Without further ado, let's go straight over to our guest, Max Abrams, a professor of political science at Northeastern University. Mr. Abrams, welcome to the program. Now, if it is confirmed that US forces had to flee from American-backed rebels, what does that say about Washington's Syria strategy?
I think that it underscores how problematic it is for the U.S. to put boots on the ground. We've discovered this many times in the Muslim world when the U.S. deploys its troops, whether it's Afghanistan or Iraq or Syria. Ultimately, the U.S. is seen as the enemy. We're seen as the occupiers. And so in that sense, it's very, very counterproductive. Furthermore, the incident really highlights the difficulty Americans have been having in identifying moderate Syrian rebels. The U.S. has spent over $1 billion each year since about 2011, 2012 to develop a moderate Syrian opposition. And this has been, it's been worse than wasted money. Not only have we been unable to find effective rebel fighters for us, but in many cases, the ones identified as moderate, especially those from the Free Syrian Army, have defected to the Al-Qaeda affiliate there, Nusra, or even to Islamic State. So the fact that this Free Syrian Army group, which is known in the United States as among the most moderate of all the rebels, the fact that they would threaten to slaughter Americans really shouldn't actually be that surprising, given their track record.
Now, these rebels were reportedly calling the American soldiers infidels and crusaders. And now these are forces that are supposed to be working together. What could have changed or sparked the change in their attitude towards the Americans?
I honestly don't think that there's a big change in their attitude. I think it's a misperception by the U.S. administration that these rebel fighters are moderate. I've been saying for years now that they're actually not moderate, that many of them are, Salafist. They work together with Al-Qaeda for a reason. Not necessarily these guys in particular, but other rebel groups like Ahrar al-Sham are almost inseparable from Nusra. And so I think that the U.S. has overestimated how useful these rebels will be on the ground. And only now, when the U.S. actually embeds itself on the ground, and when incidents like these are caught on video, does it become undeniable that actually they're really quite extreme.
Now, the U.S. claims to only back so-called moderate rebels. Do you think that the U.S. needs to have a rethink in how they categorize these rebels now, especially after this latest incident?
The reason why we haven't been able to find moderate rebels isn't due to a lack of looking. We've looked very, very hard. We wanted to find moderate rebels to both displace Islamic State and Nusra, and even to replace the Assad regime. The reason why we haven't been able to work with the rebels is because it turns out that there really aren't that many moderates who are effective fighters. And so I think the problem isn't in our ability to identify the moderates. I think the real problem is overall the lack of real moderates.
Russian President Vladimir Putin's chauffeur, this car crash happening in the official presidential car. We have a video footage of the scene of this. Earlier today, Alex discussed it on the show. Take a look.
Vladimir Putin's favorite chauffeur killed in accident exactly as former CIA director described on TV on Charlie Rose. Mike Morrell, former deputy director of the CIA, salivates over the idea of covertly killing Russians and Iranians. The full conversation aired on PBS on August 8th. This happens a month ago, and then a few weeks later, boom, the magic crash.
There's a lot of speculation about who may have done this, but it looks like an assassination attempt on Vladimir Putin's life, possibly in retaliation for the Ukraine. Could this be a Western source, something tied to Hillary perhaps? Information is still unfolding, but what we do know is this looks like a violent message sent to Putin regarding his favorite chauffeur and his death, or possibly an attempt on Putin's life himself. Now, the chauffeur had a premonition earlier last month saying that he knew that he could possibly die in this way. Just like Princess Diana, she had the same premonition 10 months before her death. She said, they're going to kill me, here's how they're going to do it. 10 months later, she was dead in the exact way she knew she was going to die. It also sounds like the death of Michael Hastings, and he had a premonition similar to this. He said, somebody's messed with my car. He actually went to a friend's house and begged to borrow the car the weekend before he died, saying that he thought that he was going to die in a similar way, and the chauffeur having the same premonition. Now, this crash, going back to it for a moment, it's not often that a head of state or a superpower nation is sent such a dramatic and violent message like this, and it appears that the killing of President Vladimir Putin's favorite chauffeur is perhaps sending a message directly to him.
Gazdief has more on this story.
Over a 24-hour period, American spy planes made repeated attempts to get close to the Russian border, the Russian Defense Ministry says. Unfortunately, they were detected both times. As they approached the Russian coast, fighter jets were scrambled in Crimea. They intercepted those American spy planes, and the spy planes turned around, headed back out towards the Black Sea. The Americans have confirmed that an incident took place, and they, as traditionally tradition dictates now, blamed the Russians.
The incident was an unsafe, close-range intercept of a Navy Poseidon aircraft while it conducted routine operations in international airspace over the Black Sea.
The aircraft we're talking about is the American P-8 Poseidon, a modern, sophisticated maritime aircraft designed to hunt submarines and ships. Its secondary role, though, is electronic surveillance, and these have tried multiple times over the last several weeks to get close to the Russian border. Now, here's, just for reference, a map showing you the Black Sea. The incident happened somewhere here. This is 8,000 kilometers away from the United States and within 100 kilometers of Russia. So the Russians are being accused of being hostile for chasing away a potential adversary from their borders. But what happens when the roles are reversed?
The Russian jet has buzzed a U.S. Navy spy plane. We don't know how close precisely, but it's described as dangerously close.
It was a very close interaction indeed. Pentagon officials saying that an Su-27 Russian jet earlier today flew within 10 feet of a U.S. Navy P-8 patrol aircraft.
You may remember, back in June, there were a few big stories about how NATO fighter jets had to be scrambled to intercept Russian aircraft in the Baltics. They were flying then in international airspace, yet nevertheless Russia was being hostile. It seems like a no-win situation. If Russia chases away NATO jets at its borders, it's being hostile. If Russian jets fly next to NATO member states, it's being hostile.
The American planes were flying in what the military calls silent mode, with their transponders switched off, which are used to identify aircraft. When turned off, planes remain undetected by radar. Aside from military concerns, passenger flights over the Black Sea were allegedly endangered because of the jet's clandestine maneuvers. As you can see, the Black Sea is a very busy area, and flying with transponders switched off does not let surrounding aircraft know that there's a jet nearby. We discussed the incident with military analysts.
It's extremely dangerous, and it's basically a provocation for a hostile act. And I think that the Russian Ministry of Defense should file a formal complaint about that. When an aircraft like that is flying without its transponders, it cannot be identified, and it was only right that Russian jets scrambled to at least identify what the aircraft was. And basically, with the transponder off, it tells me, at least, that the aircraft was probing, sensing what would light up, what radar systems would light up that would cause that would be alerted, and what defense systems would be would come on as a result in order to identify where they are actually located. And be in that area is almost a provocation in and of itself. You don't see Russian aircraft flying within 100 kilometers of the U.S. border or stationing ships out as we have.
Seems to be a policy-driven provocation, something that is geared to produce a reaction that might play into the hands of those in the United States who are looking for conflict. When we do have an exercise of when you want to watch them. So I don't think it's a coincidence.